Welcome to the ASEAN Wong podcast, where we bring you expert insights and regional perspectives on Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific geopolitics and geoeconomics. I'm your host, Dr. Prashant Paramaswaran. If you haven't already, do subscribe to the ASEAN Wong platform at www.aseanwong.com so you don't miss our posts. Our guest today is Dr. Deborah Elms, who is the head of trade policy at the Hinrich Foundation. She's advised policymakers, businesses, and institutions on a range of trade and economic related issues. She previously held various roles, including as founder and executive director of the Asia Trade Center, which published the Talking Trade blog, which I was a frequent reader of, terrific source of information. And she was also a senior fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies think tank in Singapore, which is one of its most renowned think tanks. So we'll start our conversation talking about where Southeast Asia fits within geoeconomic pacts and derisking amidst U.S. China competition. But do listen, read, and watch to the full episode where we'll discuss a range of other subjects, including U.S. trade policy and trade fragmentation in the global order. And so with that, Deborah, welcome to the ASEAN Wong podcast. And I wanted to just jump right into it. We've got two of these big trade pacts that seems to be the kind of subject of frequent conversation. And both of them are pacts which China is trying to join and wants to join, and the U.S. is out of. One is the CPTPP, which is a very kind of long acronym, which started as the sort of P4 pact, right, with Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, expanded to include the United States, became the TPP, the U.S. withdrew, and now we have the CPTPP agreement, which doesn't involve the U.S. Japan has kind of taken it forward, and other countries are forward, and then now China is trying to join it. So that's on the one side. Now we have also the digital economic I'm blanking here on the exact name, the DEPA, which is the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, I think if I'm right. And it was started with Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, but expansion has began with Korea this year, and there are a bunch of other countries in the line as well, China, the UAE, Costa Rica, Peru, so on and so forth. So in both these pacts, China has applied to join them, and the United States is not part of them. And there's been a lot of conversation about what the odds are of China actually joining these agreements, CPTPP and DEPA. If you were to think about the odds of China joining both of these agreements, what would you put it at in terms of a percentage, and where do you see this likelihood coming to play? Is this something that will happen within the next year, or is it a much longer term prospect, and what are the implications?
Well, that's a great question, and as you were saying it, I was thinking this was such a hot topic last year and has sort of fallen below the radar this year. Maybe there's just too much trade news in other areas, but I think it's worth reflecting on both China into DEPA and China into CPTPP because they matter. So let me start with the potentially easier one first, which is DEPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. This is a digital-only deal that was, as you mentioned, started by three of the members in the CPTPP, who, when the agreement closed back in 2014, decided that the digital elements, which are important in CPTPP, but pretty thin, because in digital terms, this was like eons ago, they decided that they were relatively thin and that they needed to start a process of developing new kinds of digital rules with a potentially different audience that could be accommodating, but easier to accommodate especially new technological developments. So they started this DEPA, and the idea was it would grow, right? We're going to start with 3 small open economies, just like the TPP started the same way, and we would grow from there, and we would create this sort of integrated digital-only deal. It came into force, DEPA did, slowly. Chile had some government issues, COVID happened, so it came into force very slowly, and it took a while for people to start getting actually that interested in DEPA, but once they realized that this was available and that you could, in fact, join DEPA They became a long line of countries. South Korea is the first one to finish the process of accession. And as you mentioned, China applied quite early, along with Canada, to join as well. And they've started working parties for both China and Canada to see if they can join the DEPA. Now, why did China join the DEPA or want to join the DEPA? A big part of it was that they were simultaneously trying to get into the CPTPP, the larger comprehensive trade deal. And one of the objections to China joining the CPTPP has always been that China can't do or won't do or isn't capable of doing, depending on who we talk to, digital. That their domestic structure for digital regulation and digital rules is so opposite everyone else that China can't do, won't do, couldn't do digital. And I think the Chinese response to that was to say, are you sure about that? We're going to try to join DEPA at the same time, as a way to demonstrate that we can, in fact, do digital and that we're serious about our CPTPP entry. So they applied to join DEPA. I think that should be, personally, that should be a relatively straightforward thing to do for China to join DEPA, because the way that DEPA is structured is designed to allow countries to more easily join. So it's less ambitious in general, a lot of flexibilities, and most crucially in DEPA, the two most important parts of a digital economy agreement on data flows and where do you host the data, where do you have to house that data, are carved out. So it's not that, those are the hardest things for China. They're carved out of DEPA. So I don't think it's going to be, I personally don't think it's going to be that difficult for China to join DEPA, except for, of course, the politics, which is problematic. And it would require governments to say, we are comfortable with making the political decision to allow China to join DEPA. It's not actually, in my view, a sort of technical, practical, digital related element for DEPA. So I suspect it may happen, but the other thing that has changed slightly, I have heard a lot less out of China discussing DEPA. So I think their enthusiasm for doing DEPA was always a sort of sidebar way to get into TPP rather than we want to join DEPA for the sake of joining DEPA. We'll see. We'll see whether that moves forward or not. I think it's, again, it could move very quickly if the members decided to do so. They've already got the working group open. China is also part of the joint statement initiative at the WTO on e-commerce. So China has agreed to a set of rules at the global body, which are similar to or in alignment with what DEPA wants. And so I think once you've done it in one setting, it's hard to argue that you would somehow behave differently in another setting. So we'll see what happens with DEPA in China. And I apologize for this long answer, but it's a kind of complicated set of things you've asked. On CPTPP, though, that's a bit more difficult. And it's not because, in my view, it's not because China can't do CPTPP. It is a very, I mean, here's the CPTPP right here. It is a super complicated legal text with 1,000 pages and all sorts of schedules and things. China, of course, could do CPTPP, in my view. There are some challenging areas, like with all members, to be honest. There's always something that's like, duh. But I think it can do so. The real issue for China, of course, is the politics again, which is, are the members prepared to make a statement about Chinese entry into this agreement? For a variety of reasons, some of the CPTPP countries, there are 11 CPTPP countries, now 12 with the UK becoming a formal member, those 12 members would have to say, we think China will abide by all of the rules in this agreement, and we feel comfortable making that statement. That is a little bit more challenging. So it's not actually about the agreement as much as it is about the politics. And, you know, are those politics going to change? They haven't moved in the direction that China would have wanted, I would say. It's not become easier for China. It's become potentially a bit more challenging for China rather than the reverse. But I do think that China wants to get into the CPTPP, and they have been taking steps with the various members to rectify what are often called bilateral irritants, to say we are a perfectly good a member of this larger organization. We are going to be a rule-abiding member. Let's have those conversations.
Great. So on both, I mean, I like the way that you framed the sort of variation between both agreements. I'm just wondering, given what you said about the digital agreement and how some of the parts that have actually been carved out already, including cross-border data flows, which, as you said, that's a sensitive issue not just for China, but even in Southeast Asia, there are different countries that have different approaches on that. And on CPTPP, I guess the optics, going back to your point about politics versus the actual agreement, if China were to join, it would seem like this was an agreement that the U.S. put a lot of emphasis on. They withdrew. Now China is in. But in terms of the actual agreements and the rules that are being written on trade, what would that do to China's ability to have a greater influence on how the rules are working? Because there are, as you said, several other members in both agreements that would be able to exercise their own agency as well. So it's not like China would be able to exercise sort of wanton dominance on either of the agreements. But to what extent does this actually affect the geopolitics and the geoeconomics of China's position, other than the optics and the politics?
Well, that's another good question. I think, let me start with CPTPP, where I think it's easier for me to answer. Why did China want to join the CPTPP is, I think, an important question. I think it's because even before this latest downturn domestically in the Chinese economy, there was a sense among policymakers in China that they were potentially headed for challenges. I don't think they expected quite what they've gotten, but they expected some challenges. And that they needed to push through some potentially challenging but important domestic level economic reforms. It is hard to push through unpopular reforms, even in an authoritarian regime, because you still have to accommodate domestic interests. And one of the ways that governments frequently do this is they try to join something ambitious, and then they can say to their constituents, I would love to help you out. I would love to continue to protect you, or I would love to subsidize, or I would love whatever. But unfortunately, I cannot, because this other agreement has eliminated that as an option. And so that's a very politically popular, palatable way for governments to push through reforms domestically that they are otherwise nervous about. That's why Vietnam, for example, joined the CPTPP, because Vietnam said, we have domestic reforms. We put a lot of them in place when we joined the World Trade Organization, like China, but that sort of run its course. And in order for us to make the next level, we have to sign on to ambitious agreements, like with the European Union, like the CPTPP. Vietnam did it very successfully. And I think China looked at that and said, actually for us, that would be useful too, right? Like we don't have to do this ourselves. We could do it in conjunction with others, and there are real economic benefits for being in the CPTPP. So I think the Chinese effort around CPTPP was really about how can we push those domestic reforms in areas that are otherwise challenging, like, as with every market, agricultural trade is always hard. I mean, China's an agricultural exporter of a lot of different things, but they also have, like every country, domestic restrictions on inbound agricultural imports sometimes. That is a problem. And so how do we make sure that we open up our market? Challenging, but CPTPP says all tariffs need to come off agricultural goods, basically all agricultural goods, with a few very small, cream cheese for Japan is the only real exception. So I think, again, China said, let's pursue this. It'll make us do domestic things that are important. And I think that argument still holds. However, the larger geopolitics were always challenging and have gotten more complicated recently. And I think that's where the issues around CPTPP entry have landed, I guess, at least for the moment.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I like the way that you sort of drew the connection between how countries join these agreements in terms of their foreign policies or economic and trade policies, but that has domestic implications as well. That's an important connection to make. I wanted to jump into another topic that gets a lot of kind of conversation, but there's actually a lot of uncertainty about what exactly people mean when they talk about it, which is this conception of, earlier there were kind of more, I guess, fearful metaphors and analogies around decoupling. now we've sort of repackaged it and talked about de-risking. And lots of buzz, especially about U.S. efforts to diversify Indo-Pacific supply chains away from China. And Southeast Asian leaders have expressed concerns privately and publicly. I think Singapore Prime Minister Lawrence Wong last year has even noted that even selective decoupling in areas like technology would be disastrous and quite concerning. But at the same time, I mean, that's on the one hand, the sort of fears that are happening. At the same time, on the trade front, you sort of see, sort of, depending on what data you look at, differing perceptions. I mean, I recall last year, the Peterson Institute of International Economics came up with a study, I think last September, that said, actually, there was a marked increase, if you look at the past decade, in terms of concentration of exports and imports of supply chains, rather than diversification, which implies the question is, I mean, how difficult is this going to be in practice to diversify, given that we're seeing actual concentration in the past decade? So I wondered if I could pose it to you, if as we're talking about these things like de-risking of sort of supply chains away from China, it's interesting to talk about, but how much of that is actually happening or is possible?
That's a great question. I mean, it's very easy for media and politicians to say, you should de-risk. You should decouple, you should de-risk, we should think about fences and yards and whatever else. Like, that's very easy to say. It is much more challenging to actually do it. And so, an example that I regularly give is why. So to back up and ask the question, why is it that China has become such a manufacturing powerhouse in the first place? And how easy is it to replace what China does? And you start with something like, I don't know, let's take the little mouse on my computer, right? You say, if you want to make this mouse in China, you send them a vision. You say, well, you know what, start with this mouse here, this one here, but I don't like how big it is. So can you make this for me half the size? And they will come back within 24 hours. You'll find a supplier who will deliver to your desk a half size gizmo in 24 hours. And then you look at it and you say, oh, actually, you know what, I don't, it's too tall, make it shorter. Another one 24 hours later. Then you say to them, well, actually, you know what, we've got this special event coming out. I want it in pink for some sort of event we're doing. And you get 5 samples in different shades of pink 24 hours later. And you say, this is the one that I want. I need 10,000 of them and I need it delivered by Friday. And boom, 10,000 pink, exactly as you designed it, things arrive in your warehouse or whatever on Friday. Nobody else can do that, because that requires not just the manufacturing capacity, but a whole ecosystem that allows you to say, how do we make plastic housing and all of the components smaller? And how do we deal with, like, even things like making it pink requires you to have connections to folks who have dyes and chemicals or whatever else that make pink, and in quantities that you can get quickly, deliver the packaging for the box to put the thingy in, and then the box around those boxes to get it to you on Friday. Nobody else can do that. So it's one thing for politicians to say, you know, it's risky for you to make all of those pink mice in China. And a firm could say, yeah, it's, you know, okay, it's maybe it's not the highest risk kind of category, but yes, it could be risky. We should diversify. But then they start going around the universe and they say, well, you know, where else could we find people who can make mice? And the answer is actually there aren't that many places that can make them in the first place. And if you find someone who can make the mouse, which is great, they can't change it to pink. And if they can change it to pink, they require suppliers who get the dyes and the chemicals from China, and that's another 6-week lead time. And then you get the prototype another 4 weeks after that. And then you have to decide, you know, your event is long since gone. So it's harder than you think to quickly diversify, first of all. It costs a lot more, crucially, because China has not just speed, but scale and also cost. So even though stuff out of China is not necessarily cheap, the alternatives tend to be much more expensive and much more lengthy in terms of time. And then you say, well, you know, we're facing, especially now, inflation headwinds. We've got consumers that aren't buying that many mice for their computers because of whatever. They're not Companies don't want a branded pink mouse for this event we're hosting. Is this the moment when we want to switch to a higher cost supplier? The answer is usually no. So we are seeing supply chains diversify, because there are some things that you say, wow, actually that is kind of dangerous. We should think about this, or we're prepared to pay a different cost. Or maybe we do the search and we discover, actually, as long as we have a long enough lead time, we're okay with taking a little bit longer to get the mouse, as long as we get what we want. So there are the data does show that there is the beginning of some movement, but it's not as fast as a politician or a media would make you think. And it's often, and I think this is where the concentration comes from, who's moving supply chains? It's the Chinese manufacturer of pink dyes that is moving into, say, Vietnam. It's not that the Vietnamese have themselves said, oh, we have this incredible opportunity to make, pink dye. It's the Chinese manufacturer who says, actually, we can see how the trend lines look. We should move some of our production into Vietnam so that we're capable of managing this if necessary. That's the shift in the supply chains. It's not so much firm in Vietnam says, wow, here's an opportunity, let's take advantage of it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like how you clarified as well that when we're talking about diversification of supply chains and de-risking, we really need to be clear as well as to what industries we are looking at, or to use the U.S. term, how big is the yard and how high is the fence, and what are we putting in there, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to actually shift now to talk about the U.S. And you've written about this quite a bit, actually, including on USTR. But the sort of lack of, from a Southeast Asian perspective, real sort of U.S. trade policy with market access, and the U.S. really getting into things like it was under the Obama administration with the TPP and so on and so forth. I think for the Biden administration folks, despite those obstacles, they've seen at least some inroads in terms of how they're thinking about new economic initiatives. So things like the Indo-Pacific economic framework, and thinking about supply chains that we just talked about, economic corridors and just energy transition partnerships. We've seen those economic corridors now in the Philippines and Africa. We've got jet peas now with South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So there are new economic ideas, but that's not the same as trade policy, right? And so my question is, if we're thinking about this, and this is just one administration, we have an election coming up. We've gone through now 2 cycles of administrations that have behaved very differently on trade than the sort of traditional thing that Southeast Asian countries might expect of the U.S. I guess the bigger question might be whether we see, whichever party wins, and if we see President Kamala Harris or President Donald Trump, is this really the new normal in U.S. trade policy, where the U.S. is finding ways to talk around trade rather than actually doing trade policy? Or is there maybe a scenario where maybe this is not all baked in? I mean, we might actually see an administration have a more active trade policy in a different environment. How baked in is this, given the domestic dynamics in Washington and approaches of administrations? And what's your perspective on how that might play out after the election, which I guess is the big question everyone's trying to talk about and plan for, given the next few months?
Yes, but once again, you've asked a fantastic question. And the way that you phrased it, I think, is particularly good. Let me back up just a bit.